The pink dress was the first thing Silas Blackwood noticed. It was the color of a sunrise in a season that had forgotten the sun, a pale, hopeful thing against the fury of the blizzard. It was wrong. Everything about it was wrong. The flimsy cotton, the delicate stitching at the collar, and the woman inside it, huddled on his porch like a fallen bird, were all meant for a gentler world than the one that existed at the end of his long, snow-choked lane in the Wyoming Territory. His German shepherd, Bo, let out a low growl from the cabin doorway, the sound a deep rumble of warning. Silas put a hand on the dog's head. "Easy, boy." He had been a widower for 3 years, and in that time, his world had shrunk to the size of his homestead, the sturdy log cabin his father had built, the barn that smelled of hay and horses, and the vast, silent plains that promised nothing but more silence. He was not a man who expected visitors. Especially not in a storm that had been raging since dawn, a white wall of wind and ice that erased the line between earth and sky. He pulled on his heavy coat and stepped outside, the wind snatching the breath from his lungs. The woman did not look up. Her head was bent, a thin grey scarf wrapped around her hair, dark strands escaping to whip across her face. She was small, fine-boned, and shivering so violently the movement was a continuous shudder. She was Chinese, her features exquisitely drawn and pale with a cold so deep it was close to death. In her lap, her hands, blue and stiff, were clenched around a worn leather satchel. Silas stopped a few feet away. His voice was rough from disuse. She flinched, her head snapping up. Her eyes were dark, wide with a fear that seemed frozen in place. She tried to speak, but only a dry, chattering sound came out. She looked impossibly young, no more than 20. "You need to come inside," Silas said, his words clipped by the wind. "You'll die out here." She shook her head, a small, stubborn gesture that cost her what little energy she had left. She pushed a folded piece of paper toward him, her fingers too numb to properly hold it. The wind caught it, but Silas was faster, snatching it from the air. He unfolded it inside the shelter of his coat. The handwriting was a brutish, angular scrawl he recognized instantly. It was addressed to Alastair Finch, the man who owned the freight company and half the town of Promise Creek. The letter was a simple confirmation of passage paid for one bride, arriving on the weekly freight wagon. Her name was listed as Mai. Silas looked from the paper to the woman. The freight wagon wasn't due for 2 more days, and it never came this far out. The driver must have gotten lost in the storm, panicked, and left her at the first sign of life he saw, eager to be rid of his responsibility. He had left her to die on the porch of a stranger. But the most important fact was the name on the paper. She was meant for Alastair Finch. And Silas knew Finch. He was a man whose smiles were colder than the winter wind, a man who collected pretty things and broke them when he grew bored. "This isn't Finch's place," Silas said, raising his voice to be heard over the storm. "You're 10 miles west of town." Tears welled in her eyes, freezing on her lashes. She understood. She understood she was in the wrong place, at the mercy of the wrong man, in the middle of a storm that would kill her before she could ever reach her destination. She sagged against the rough log wall of the cabin, a wave of despair washing over her. Silas had spent years building a life that asked nothing of anyone and offered the same in return. He kept to himself, did his work, and minded the boundaries of his own grief. To bring this woman inside was to invite trouble he had long since learned to avoid. Finch would not be happy. The town would talk. A white man, a widower, taking in a young Chinese woman promised to another. It was a fire in a dry field. But the alternative was to watch her die. He looked at her face, at the delicate line of her jaw, the way she held herself with a shred of dignity even now. He saw the ghost of his own wife, Sarah, in that stubborn refusal to be broken by the harshness of this land. Something in his chest, a place long frozen over, cracked. He stepped forward, his shadow falling over her. "The storm's not letting up. You're coming inside." He didn't make it a question. He reached down, expecting her to resist, but she was too weak. His hands wrapped around her arm, and he was shocked at how little she weighed. He lifted her to her feet, and she leaned against him, her body trembling uncontrollably. He guided her toward the door, Bo moving aside to let them pass, whining softly. Inside, the warmth of the fire was a physical blow. The cabin was one large room, spare and clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a bed was tucked into a corner, and a simple wooden table and 2 chairs sat in the center. It was the home of a man who lived without sentiment. He helped her to the chair closest to the hearth. "I've got room by the fire," he told her, his voice softer now that they were out of the wind. He knelt and began to unlace her thin, soaked boots. "And I don't care who talks." She watched him, her dark eyes filled with a mixture of fear and exhaustion. He worked methodically, pulling off the ruined boots and chafing her frozen feet between his rough, calloused hands. He wrapped them in a drywall blanket from his bed. He moved to the stove and ladled a steaming broth into a mug, the smell of herbs and salt filling the small space. He held it out to her. "Here. Drink this. Slow." Her hands were shaking too badly to hold the mug, so he held it to her lips himself. She took a small, hesitant sip, then another. The warmth spread through her, and for the first time since he'd found her, the tension in her shoulders eased by a fraction. She looked from his face to the fire, then around the quiet, simple room. She was safe, for now. But Silas knew the storm outside was nothing compared to the one that would break when the snow cleared and Alastair Finch came looking for what he considered his property. The thought settled in his gut like a cold stone. He had invited the world back into his quiet life, and he had no idea if he was strong enough to face it. The blizzard raged for 3 days, cocooning the small cabin in a world of white. The silence was broken only by the crackle of the fire and the howl of the wind. For Silas, the quiet was familiar, but the presence of another person changed its texture. It was no longer the silence of solitude, but of waiting. Mai recovered slowly. The deep, rattling cough she'd developed on the second day began to ease. She spoke little, her English careful and halting, but her hands were never idle. She insisted on helping, mending a tear in one of Silas's shirts with stitches so small and perfect they were nearly invisible. She learned the rhythm of his home without being told, rising early to add wood to the stove, her movements graceful and quiet. Silas found himself watching her. He watched the way her slender fingers carded wool for new socks, the focused line of her brow as she kneaded dough for bread, using the small supply of flour he had. She was not the helpless creature he had carried inside. There was a core of resilience in her, a quiet strength that reminded him of the prairie grass that bends in the wind but never breaks. Bo, who was suspicious of all strangers, had taken to her completely. He would lay his great head in her lap as she sat by the fire, and she would stroke his ears, murmuring to him in her own language, the words soft and musical. Silas had trusted his dog's judgment for years, and Bo's acceptance of Mai settled something in him. On the 4th morning, they awoke to a profound silence. The wind had died. Sunlight, pale and thin, streamed through the window, glinting off a world buried in snow. The storm had broken. "I have to go to town," Silas said, breaking the morning quiet. "I'm low on flour and salt. And coffee." Mai looked up from the fire, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Finch," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "He'll be looking for you," Silas confirmed. He could leave her here, tell Finch the wagon driver had made a mistake and he'd kept her safe. But the thought of handing her over to that man made him physically ill. It felt like a betrayal, not just of her, but of some principle he thought he'd buried with his wife. He would not give another good thing to this brutal country without a fight. "You'll come with me," he decided, the words spoken before he had fully weighed their consequence. "It's better if we face this head-on. In public." She simply nodded, a flicker of fear in her eyes, but she did not argue. She trusted him. The weight of that trust was heavier than a winter's snow. The ride to Promise Creek was slow, the horses struggling through the deep drifts. The town emerged from the white landscape like a charcoal sketch, a handful of clapboard buildings huddled together against the cold. As they rode down the main street, windows fogged over, but Silas could feel the eyes on them. A lone rancher and a young Chinese woman riding together in his wagon. The gossip was already starting, a spark landing in dry tinder. He pulled up in front of the general store. Before he could even help me down, the door opened. Alistair Finch stepped out. He was a tall man, impeccably dressed in a tailored wool coat and polished boots that seemed immune to the street's mud and slush. He was handsome in a severe way, his face clean-shaven, his eyes a pale, cold blue. "Blackwood," Finch said, his voice smooth and pleasant, a dangerous sound. "I heard the storm dropped an unexpected package on your doorstep. I've come to collect it." He didn't look at Mai, speaking of her as if she were a misdelivered crate of goods. Silas stood his ground, placing himself between the wagon and Finch. "She's no package, Finch." The driver left her in a blizzard. She would have died. "A regrettable inconvenience," Finch said with a dismissive wave of his hand. "But her passage was paid. I have the contract. She belongs to me." He finally turned his cold gaze on Mai, who shrank back under its intensity. "Come here, girl." A small crowd had begun to gather, storekeepers and ranchers drawn by the confrontation. They watched, their faces impassive, waiting to see how the widower from the hills would stand up to the most powerful man in town. Silas felt a familiar anger tighten his jaw. "She's a person, not a piece of property. She'll decide where she goes." Finch laughed, a short, ugly sound. "She has no say in the matter. The law is quite clear." He took a step forward, his hand outstretched. "Now, I won't have my business interfered with by a lonely farmer." It was then that Mai did something unexpected. She straightened her shoulders, her small frame seeming to gain stature. She met Finch's gaze directly. "I am not property," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried in the cold, still air. Each word was clear, her English precise. "You are not the man who wrote the letters." Finch's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. A flicker of confusion, then anger, crossed his face. "What nonsense is this? Get down from that wagon." But her words had planted a seed of doubt. The townspeople murmured among themselves. Silas looked at her, seeing a fire he hadn't known she possessed. He had thought he was protecting her, but in that moment, she was fighting her own battle. He made his choice. "The lady has spoken," Silas said, his voice ringing with a finality that surprised even himself. "She's under my protection. If you have a legal claim, you can take it up with the territorial marshal when he makes his circuit next spring." He was challenging Finch's authority in front of the entire town. It was a reckless, foolish move. Finch's face hardened, the polite mask falling away to reveal the cold fury beneath. "You will regret this, Blackwood," Finch hissed, his voice low and venomous. "You and your little stray." He turned on his heel and stalked back into the store, slamming the door behind him. The crowd dispersed, unwilling to be seen taking a side. As Silas helped Mai down from the wagon, the freight master, a man named Henderson who owed his job to Finch, stepped out of the shadows of the alley. "That supply order you placed," Henderson muttered, not looking Silas in the eye. "Might get lost in the snow." "A lot of things get lost out here." The threat was clear. This was no longer just about gossip. Finch was aiming to cut him off, to starve them out. Silas looked at Mai, who stood beside him, her face pale but her chin held high. He had chosen this fight. Now, they would have to find a way to survive it. The journey back to the ranch was heavy with a new kind of silence. The open defiance in town had felt like a victory, but now, in the vast emptiness of the plains, it felt like a declaration of war. Finch would not let the insult stand. Henderson's threat about the supply wagon was not an idle one. Silas had enough to last a month, maybe 6 weeks if they were careful. After that, they would be at the mercy of the winter. That evening, the air in the cabin was thick with unspoken tension. They ate their meal of stew and hard bread without a word. Bo lay by the hearth, his head on his paws, sensing the disquiet. After they had cleared the simple meal, Mai went to her small satchel. She hesitated for a moment, then pulled out a thin bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. "He is right," she said, her voice soft. I am not the man from the letters. She corrected her own grammar, a habit Silas had noticed. He is not the man. She handed one of the letters to Silas. He took it, the paper surprisingly fine, the ink a deep, steady black. He had expected Finch's crude scrawl, but the handwriting was elegant, almost artistic. The words were even more surprising. They spoke of the beauty of the vast, open land, of the solace of a quiet life, of a partnership built on respect and shared work. It was a portrait of a thoughtful, gentle man. This isn't Finch's hand, Silas said, looking up at her. And these aren't his words. Finch doesn't see beauty in this land. He only sees what he can take from it. I know this now, Mai said. She looked into the fire, her reflection dancing in her dark eyes. My family in California, they needed money. My father is not well. This arrangement was to help them. I thought I was coming to a good man. A lonely man, perhaps, but a good one. A cold realization dawned on Silas. Finch couldn't have written these letters. He likely paid someone to do it for him, someone with a poet's soul and a desperate need for cash. He had built a beautiful lie to lure her here. The deception was cruel, calculated. Who else is there in town? Mai asked. Someone who writes well. Silas thought for a moment. There's the telegraph operator, a young man named Peterson. Quiet. Always has his head in a book. Finch holds the note on his family's farm back east. He could have forced him. The scale of Finch's manipulation was staggering. He hadn't just bought a bride, he had stolen her hope. The next few days passed in a state of high alert. Every sound from outside, the creak of a branch, the call of a hawk, made Silas reach for the rifle he now kept propped by the door. The promised supply wagon never came. Then, one afternoon, 2 riders appeared on the horizon. They weren't from town. They were hard-faced men with rifles slung across their saddles, the kind of men who hired their guns to the highest bidder. They rode directly to the cabin and dismounted, their movement slow and deliberate. Blackwood, the taller one, called out, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. Mr. Finch sent us. He wants his property back. Says you're to hand over the Chinese girl, and we can all forget this happened. Silas stepped onto the porch, his own rifle held loosely in his hands. Bo stood beside him, hackles raised, a low growl vibrating in his chest. I already told Finch, Silas said, his voice steady. She's not property, and she's not going anywhere. That's the wrong answer, the second man said, smiling unpleasantly. Finch is paying us well to get the right one. Silas knew he was outmatched. These men were killers. He could maybe take one of them, but not both. He braced himself, accepting that this was how it would end, on his own porch, defending a woman he barely knew but had come to respect more than any person he'd met in years. Just as the men started to spread out, the cabin door opened. Mai stepped out. She wasn't carrying a weapon. In her hands, she held the branding iron from the fire, its tip glowing a malevolent orange in the grey afternoon light. She didn't say a word. She simply walked to Silas's side and stood there, her small frame radiating a fierce, unyielding resolve. She was ready to fight, to die, beside him. The sight of her, so determined and fearless with that primitive, brutal weapon, gave the hired guns pause. They had come expecting to intimidate a lone, grieving rancher. They found 2 people, a man and a woman, standing together as a single unit, backed by a snarling wolf of a dog. The fight would be messy. It would be costly. It might not be worth what Finch was paying them. The tall man spat on the ground. This ain't over, Blackwood. They mounted their horses and rode away, leaving a ringing silence in their wake. Silas's hands were shaking. He leaned his rifle against the wall, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Mai dropped the heavy iron into the snow, where it hissed and steamed. As she turned to go back inside, a small, worn pouch fell from her dress pocket. Silas bent to pick it up. It was light. He loosened the drawstring, expecting to see a coin or 2. Instead, he found a handful of seeds. Tiny, dark specks of promise. He recognized some as bean and squash seeds, but others were foreign to him. They were seeds for a garden she had hoped to plant, a life she had hoped to grow. In this frozen, barren land, they were a testament to a faith that felt almost impossible. He closed his hand around them, the small, hard kernels a stark contrast to the violence that had just passed. He had fought for her life, but he was beginning to realize she was fighting for something more, a future. Spring arrived late that year, reluctantly giving way to the stubborn winter. The snow melted, revealing the pale, sleeping earth beneath. The 4 months since the confrontation with Finch's hired men had been hard. They had rationed their food, and Silas had spent long, dangerous days hunting to keep them from starving. But they had survived. They had survived together. Silas had sent a letter to the territorial marshal with a trusted neighbor, a fellow rancher who despised Finch. The marshal, a grim, fair-minded man, had arrived in Promise Creek a month later. Presented with Finch's fraudulent contract and the beautifully written letters, which the telegraph operator, Peterson, confessed to writing under duress, the case was clear. Finch's contract was declared void. He was publicly fined for procurement by deception, a humiliation that shattered his iron-fisted control over the town. His reputation in ruins, Finch sold his holdings at a loss and left the territory, his departure as quiet and bitter as his reign had been loud. With the threat gone, a new, gentler quiet settled over the ranch. It was the quiet of shared work, of a life being rebuilt. Silas and Mai had fallen into a comfortable partnership. He taught her how to handle the horses and mend fences, and she showed him how to make the most of their meager supplies, creating savory meals from salted meat and wild onions. One of their first projects was to build a small greenhouse against the sunny, south-facing wall of the cabin. Using old windows Silas had saved in the barn, they constructed a space where the fragile warmth of the spring sun could be trapped and nurtured. Inside, in carefully tended boxes of rich soil hauled up from the creek bed, Mai planted her seeds. To Silas's astonishment, they sprouted. Tiny green shoots pushed their way through the dark earth, a miracle of life in a place that had felt so barren. They had also ridden to the land office in the next county. With the contract nullified, Mai was legally a single woman. Under the Homestead Act, she was entitled to her own claim. They filed on the quarter section adjoining his, a stretch of land with good pasture and a clear running stream. The deed, when it arrived, was in her name, Mai Lin. It was the first thing she had ever owned. It made her his neighbor, legally and physically binding her to this land, and to him. One warm afternoon, Silas sat on the porch steps, cleaning a piece of tack. He watched Mai in her small garden, a kerchief protecting her head from the sun. She was wearing the pink dress from that first day. It was faded now, patched at the elbow and stained with honest dirt at the hem. It was no longer the dress of a frightened bride, but of a woman who was putting down roots. He remembered the shivering, terrified woman he had found huddled against his door, a ghost in the blizzard. He looked at her now, her movement strong and sure as she tied up a climbing bin vine. She had faced down Alastair Finch, hired guns, and the unforgiving Wyoming winter, and she had not broken. She had bent, and then she had grown. Bo, now graying at the muzzle, came and rested his heavy head on Silas's knee. Silas stroked the dog's familiar, warm fur, his gaze never leaving Mai. A feeling he hadn't allowed himself to name for 3 long years began to loosen in his chest. It wasn't the ghost of his past love for Sarah, but something new, something quieter and perhaps deeper, forged in a crucible of shared hardship and mutual respect. Mai looked up, as if feeling his gaze, and smiled at him. It was a small, genuine smile that reached her eyes and transformed her face. In that simple gesture, Silas saw the promise of a future he had stopped believing in. He had thought home was a place you defended from the world. He understood now that it was something you built, day by day, season by season, with the person who was brave enough to stand beside you in the cold, holding a glowing iron against the darkness. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.